You're in this vastness of space. You can find mountains that are more impressive in other places. You can find oceans that are just as beautiful. You can find many of the things you find in the Arctic in other places, but the emptiness, the remoteness, the vastness is something that I find to be incredibly unique to the Arctic.
You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For 50 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Derek Fassbender.
Welcome, listeners. I'm Derek Fassbender, host of the B&H Photography Podcast.
And I'm Jill Waterman, the podcast's senior creative producer.
And I'm Mike Weinstein, the show's technical producer and audio engineer.
In a world of perpetual motion, there exists a realm of profound stillness, where light doesn't simply illuminate, it transforms. Far from home amid Earth's frozen tundras, time itself seems suspended in crystalline air. In today's podcast, we'll visit these places where time hangs in the balance, and we'll explore the intrepid mix of endurance, patience, and vision it takes to make pictures there. Joining us in this conversation are polar photography specialists Acacia Johnson and Jonas Paurell. Here's some background on each of them. Acacia Johnson is a photographer, writer, and 2023 National Geographic explorer based in Anchorage, Alaska. Drawn to painterly light and otherworldly landscapes, her work focuses on the environment, conservation, and connections between people and place. Over the past 10 years, she has made more than 50 expeditions to the Arctic and Antarctica as a photographer and a guide, always seeking to inspire wonder and compassion for these remote regions during a time of rapid change. Her photographs have been exhibited internationally and have been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, National Geographic, and Time magazines, among other publications. In 2021, Acacia was awarded the Canon Female Photojournalist Grant, and in 2022, she received the ICP Infinity Award for Documentary Practices in Photojournalism. Jonas Paurell is an explorer, conservation photographer, photo educator, and speaker from Göteborg, Sweden. One of his most ambitious projects is a 25-year documentation of the Arctic. Through ski expeditions and icebreaker voyages, he has captured both the resilience and vulnerability of Arctic landscapes, emphasizing the fragility of the region and the urgent need for preservation. In 2022, Jonas launched the Jubilee Expedition, recreating the historic Swedish polar expedition of 1872 to highlight this region's rapid melting and the far-reaching impacts of climate change. Jonas is also founder of Terra Photography Expeditions, which offers immersive workshops in both Arctic regions and South American rainforests, helping photographers deepen their connection with nature while refining their craft. Additionally, before dedicating his life to photography, Jonas served as a human rights lawyer for the United Nations. Acacia Johnson and Jonas Paurell, welcome to the show.
Thank you, guys. It's exciting to be here. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us.
It's wonderful to have you guys. Now, Acacia, I'm going to start with you. You grew up in beautiful Alaska, surrounded by all this nature, and then you left it all to come and study photography at RISD, which is, of course, the Rhode Island School of Design. How did that extreme shift in landscape and culture influence your artistic vision early on?
So I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, which is the biggest city in Alaska, about 300,000 people, but it's surrounded by wilderness. Only 20% of Alaska is accessible by road. And since I was a really small child, traveling out into really wild areas has always been a really big part of my life. And to me, it just seemed normal, right? Like anything that children experience. And since I can remember, I've always been making pictures of the landscape and of the natural world in some form. When I left Alaska to study at RISD, it was the first time that I had really been living in a place that wasn't far northern in some way. I should mention I also lived in northern Norway in high school, above the Arctic Circle, and really, really loved it there as well. And for the first time, I started encountering stereotypes about the far north as this kind of desolate wasteland that was generalized, oh, it's all just empty up there. And it made me realize that I had something unique to share. And it really made me want to take pictures in the north. And so that began this process that I'm still continuing today, where I'm often dreaming up trips to really remote parts of the north and then going out and making those pictures and bringing the pictures back to work with. And although my kind of working mode originated in where I was from, I also learned so much at RISD, and the visual sensibility that I have today probably would not have taken shape without that experience.
I love that. It's like sometimes you have to leave what you're comfortable with to kind of appreciate it and see what other people, in this case, don't see, to really make you see what you came from and really appreciate that landscape.
Absolutely. So I think early on, my mission was to make pictures that were so beautiful and so arresting and otherworldly that people would have to stop and ask, like, where is that? What is that? Is that real? And then the answer to that is, yeah, like that's our Earth. That's the North. And it's so magical. And here's why you should care about it.
Yeah. And it's like everything you were saying earlier, it's like this desolate wasteland. It's like, man, I don't see that when I look at Alaska. It makes me want to go there. And your image is definitely mission accomplished. You have sold that as just something that is like that. You look at these images and you're like, wow, the Earth really is so spectacular. And as somebody who's spent my entire life in the Northeast, we don't get to see that on an everyday basis. And when you do get a chance to get out and explore nature, it does really just open up your senses to just this otherworldly kind of view of everything at our fingertips out there.
I think one other thing about the Arctic in particular that's easy for a lot of people to overlook is just how diverse it is. I mean, the Arctic is a global area with all kinds of different cultures and backgrounds and histories and ecosystems. And it is fascinating in each one in a completely different way.
That is a whole nother thing. I do want to touch on that as we get further into the conversation, because it is that mix of cultures. Each region is identified by its cultures and its various little nuances that make it unique. Now, Jonas, you were raised in Sweden. Your first trip up to the Arctic was for an exploration of the Scandies Mountains at the fresh age of 19. Can you talk about your first impressions of that region and how it compared to the regions closer to your home?
Absolutely. It's really the polar opposite, pun intended perhaps. I grew up on the Swedish coastal region, southern Sweden, warm, sunny, beautiful summers, fairly mild winters. The tallest mountain from my region is perhaps a couple of 100 meters tall. It's beautiful rolling granite hills and lush forests, and it's beautiful, and that's all I knew. This perhaps is hard to understand today, but of course, this is before we were inundated with images of faraway places on social media. In that day and age, we had to look specifically to find information about such regions if we wanted to actually be exposed to it. And until I was perhaps 19, I hadn't done much in terms of searching for that. I just, on a whim, came up with the idea that I wanted to go up and explore the Arctic in Sweden. And I headed up with a friend. We were 19. We had packs of 28 kilos each, completely unprepared for what we were about to experience. We had no actual understanding of the region we were going to. We just went, young, happy, free. We did our first trek, our first day up there, into a place called Kebnekaise. That's the highest mountain in Sweden, standing only at about 2,000 meters tall. But, as we got there, I just sat down on this rock and I looked on these landscapes and I saw the rock of a deep black I've never seen before, the moss and the vegetation, the lichens, everything had a more saturated color than I'd ever seen before. I had never been surrounded by what I experienced as giant mountains before. I grew up in southern Sweden and I was happy growing up there. But once I saw what was up there in the Arctic for the first time, it hit me straight in the soul. It became a lifelong obsession, I think, to revisit first and initially the Scandinavian Arctic, but then more far afield from that as well. But the difference for me was everything. It was, for a young man of 19, someone giving me free reins to the Arctic and saying, here lies adventure. Go and see for yourself, seek who you are, explore, figure out what it means. And I said initially, the polar opposite of anything I'd ever known. And that had such an incredible impact on me as a human. And I'm 43 years old and I still keep going back. I still love it. I think that contrast is perhaps what I still seek today, perhaps living in a normal place and experiencing that wild area. And it just keeps growing and keeps building. That's how it is for me, at least.
Is it just that extreme beauty? I mean, I've never been to the Arctic. I've never been to a landscape that can compare. So how would you guys describe it to somebody who's never been to a landscape like that? I mean, anybody who's been out in a very desolate area, whether it's the red rock of the Southwest United States or the desert or tundras, how would you describe that region to somebody who's never been there?
It's a hard one to describe. I think it starts for me in an emotion. It's that feeling of being at the edge of human existence. People live up there, but not many. And where they live, they're grouped together in small societies. But as soon as you leave that, you're in this vastness of space. You can find mountains that are more impressive in other places. You can find oceans that are just as beautiful. You can find many of the things you find in the Arctic in other places, but the emptiness, the remoteness, the vastness is something that I find to be incredibly unique to the Arctic. And that in itself gives you a sensation of being outside of the norm. You're in a place where you're perhaps not even supposed to be, at least not according to the norms of daily life, right? But you're there and it hits you so hard. It's hard to describe. Maybe Acacia can do it better than I am, but for me, it's just that remoteness, that feeling. And then you're just crushed by the beauty of the place at the same time. And you realize, oh my God, what a beautiful world we live in. That's it for me.
That's a beautiful description, Jonas.
I'm glad.
I also feel profoundly moved by the beauty of the Arctic. And I think there are a number of ways to define what exactly the Arctic is. And one of the predominant definitions is it is the area above tree line. So an area where the tallest trees might just be up to waist high. So the expansiveness of vision and the openness of the landscape and the impression that the sky makes in just its size and intensity contribute to this incredible experience in the landscape. And it's also a place, particularly above the Arctic Circle, with just dramatic changes in light and seasons. In the summertime, the sun literally doesn't set for months at a time. And in the wintertime, it stays below the horizon for several months. So the surge of migratory life returning into the summer in this kind of surreal, endless day, contrasted with the stillness and the deep blue of the polar night, is really incredible. I think that those are some of the qualities, together with the real vividness, especially color-wise, of the Arctic light. Those are some of the visual things that make it so impressive. And also, beyond just the visual, understanding just how much life actually persists and is able to thrive in such a harsh environment is an amazing thing to experience.
Yeah, that part right there, the life that is able to thrive and something that is often seen as an unforgiving landscape. Now, Acacia, you've spent time in both the Arctic and Antarctic regions as photographer and guide. Can you talk about the differences between the polar landscapes in the northern and southern hemispheres?
Absolutely. So I spent 7 years working on ships traveling both to the Arctic and Antarctica, typically around 200 people on the ship, and I would be the designated photography guide, just for a little bit of context. The Arctic is essentially a frozen ocean for most of the year, surrounded by continents. It's a place where people have lived subsisting off of the land and sea and the animals for thousands of years. It's very diverse. And as a tourist, I would say it's a place where wildlife can be a little bit trickier to find simply because it's spread out over such a vast area and it's been hunted in a lot of places. Whereas Antarctica is the inverse of the Arctic. It is a frozen continent surrounded by ocean. And so it has that additional difficulty of getting there, crossing the Drake Passage or other bodies of water to get there. It has no history of human habitation. The earliest exploration of it by people was only a couple hundred years ago. And the wildlife that lives there is absolutely unafraid of people and is concentrated both in the water or just kind of at the edges of the continent where there is access to the sea. And so there's actually fairly few places, to visit in Antarctica that are actually land when you consider the size of the continent, because so much of it is covered in an ice sheet.
Wow. And you guys have such a poetic way of talking about things that most people wouldn't put into words. You guys describe so wonderfully. Acacia, after graduating from art school, you were, of course, awarded a Fulbright to spend winter months living and photographing in a remote community on Baffin Island. Now, you had mentioned the sun absent for months and the sun not setting for months. How does this play into everything you do as a photographer, and how does it affect you as a person? I mean, I can't imagine the sun not setting just as much as I can't imagine the sun not coming up. Can you talk about this experience and even beyond photography, the changes that it affects in a person and how this ultimately affects your creative vision?
So the first winter that I actually ever spent above the Arctic Circle was in high school when I was living in northern Norway in a city called Narvik. And I was so struck by this intense color of dark blue. Like it's almost like a living blue, like it's illuminated somehow, even in its dark color. And I think that a lot of artists kind of find themselves drawn to the same themes or colors or something over time. And that dark blue, that's the color for me. So I knew when I was in photography school that I loved that there was something about that was really drawing me in. And a lot of the work that I was doing at RISD was sort of more conceptual. You have to write artist statements for bodies of work exhibited in art contexts. And so I would write poetically and vaguely about the connection to the Arctic landscape and what it means from a human perspective. And it was all just kind of fluff in retrospect. I didn't really have much to go on aside from my own lived experience, which is valid, but only up until a certain point. So I kind of knew that to really evolve and be an informed photographer working in the Arctic, I really needed a lot more on the ground experience living in Arctic communities. So I applied for this grant to live in a community called Arctic Bay, which is just under 1,000 people on the north of Baffin Island, which is in the Canadian high Arctic. So if you imagine the northwest coast of Greenland, it's like just across the ocean from there. And this is a place where the Inuit have lived for about 4,000 years, living largely a nomadic lifestyle, but only settled in towns as recently as the 1960s and 70s. So a huge amount of change has happened in a span of just a few generations. There are elders who still remember growing up in a traditional lifestyle, whereas the young people are growing up with the Canadian school system and social media and satellite internet. It's a very, very interesting place. So when I first went there, I boldly proposed to only go there for the darkest part of the winter. So I arrived on November 1st, and the sun set for the winter 7 days later and did not return until February. And I had proposed to do another kind of conceptual landscape project. and quickly realized that my outsider idea was just nonsensical in the context of actually living in this town. And so this is like the most important lesson I've probably learned as a photographer. Like, let the project tell you what it's about. You learn so much on the ground by just being open to experience and listening and learning from other people. One of my colleagues says, unless the project is literally about you, you don't know anything. And those were kind of lessons that I learned on the ground as that winter went on. Throughout those 4 months, I lived with an Inuit family and spent some really incredible times out on the sea ice with seal hunters. Ringed seals are one of the most important staple foods for many people across the Arctic. And I began to learn that the ethics of subsistence and conservation, the mindset of them is very much intertwined most of the time. So that I could talk endlessly about the things that I learned there, but just to rein it in back to the darkness. Yeah, it is surreal to live in darkness most of the time. Sleep schedules, sense of time can kind of get a little bit soft if you don't have something structuring it. But what I love about that season is in places that have winter with snow covering the landscape, that snow acts as a reflector. And so, whatever soft, dim color or light in the sky there is reflects off of everything in the landscape. So, it all kind of glows with this subtle living color. And there were times that winter where, the starlight itself, even without the moon, would be bright enough to see by, reflecting off of the snow. It was so beautiful. And community life also is particularly vivid. People do a lot of stuff in the winter to all stay happy and energetic through those dark months.
Acacia, I just have a quick question. You talked about the moon and the stars, but the sun never rises during these 3 or 4 months, but you see the moon on a regular schedule during the winter?
Yes, you do. I have never taken the time to understand the schedule of the moon,
Right.
for lack of a better
Yeah.
word, where to expect it rising and setting. But we absolutely did see the moon. In fact, there was one time I went out on the sea ice with some harvesters, and the moonlight was so bright that I could photograph handheld with medium format film. It was just like glowing off of the sea ice,
Wow.
which is pretty wild in a time without sunlight. One other interesting thing is that when you are very close to the North Pole, the North Star Polaris is the one steady star in the sky that doesn't move, and all the other stars, as we experience them in the Northern Hemisphere, revolve around that star. And so the constellation of stars that were above the town every day were often pretty much in the same place. They didn't move a whole lot. And so
Mm.
those constellations became part of my understanding of the community and where things were in town. Like, oh yeah, that one building is always underneath the Big Dipper. It's a thing that I've never experienced anywhere else.
Fascinating.
I know, learning to function in the dark. And it's like, here, I'm just focused on the dark, but everything else you were saying there, Acacia, makes me think that, hey, the dark wasn't even the real problem or question. It's just, there's so much more interest and intrigue to, like you had said earlier, the culture, and really just seeing how people live and how they get by, and acclimating yourself to the culture. Was that a hard gap culturally?
I think the hardest part for me personally at the time, and actually it always is every time I go back up there, is going through the transition of living in a kind of fast-paced culture where often we measure the value of our time by the things that we accomplish or achieve. And in many small Arctic communities, that is simply not the case. Things don't happen quickly, by my definitions, always. Pressing for answers or schedules or things doesn't really work in the same way. So just learning to slow down and actually listen to people and observe and wait and let go of all of my weird outsider ideas of what I thought I should be doing there. That was definitely the hardest part. I think culturally, many Arctic communities have been subjected to this history of colonialism and outsiders, researchers a lot of times coming in, taking pictures or doing science and then just disappear. And it can make people feel kind of objectified and taken advantage of for very good reason. So really having genuine connections with people, maintaining relationships over time, and doing the best that you can to be a real person first before the goals of whatever project you're working on, I think are some of the most important things I've learned from being there.
Interesting. Now, Jonas, how does that compare to your experience? I think it's interesting that although, the Arctic Circle being huge and there's a tie that binds in the landscape and in obviously the harsh challenges and everything that you face in the Arctic Circle, but how similar are the various regions in the Arctic? So Jonas, the regions that you have been to, that you have explored, from what you've heard from Acacia, can you compare and contrast what you've experienced in regards to the landscape or to the cultures?
Certainly, I see that what she describes quite poetically, actually, is not the Arctic that I know from Scandinavia. The Arctic that I've experienced in other places like Svalbard or like Greenland, etc., definitely, I would say what she's been saying sounds like a perfect fit for me. But Sweden, Norway, Finland, it's different. The Arctic there is such a normal part of our countries, of our land, of our people. Yes, we have indigenous cultures in Sweden, Norway, Finland, and I personally do not belong to that indigenous culture, but I think there is a huge symbiosis happening between the people that came from the south when Sweden was populated from the south, when there was already people living in the north. Of course, there was a lot of issues hundreds of years ago when that happened. But I think today we're looking at societies that are very much integrated in a functional and beautiful ways that still preserves the cultures that have existed there for hundreds and hundreds of years. But for me personally, I'm a nature photographer first and foremost, and I would almost say exclusively. So my subjects are snow and trees and foxes and ptarmigans and wildlife and flora that exists in an environment. And for me, that subject, it speaks to me the way it speaks to me. And since I'm not necessarily documenting the culture, but rather the nature, it doesn't impact me as profoundly, perhaps, as it has impacted Acacia in this instance. So I think there's a huge difference between the Scandinavian countries and other Arctic regions. But secondly, my experience perhaps is not so profound with those cultures as well, even though I have lived up in the subarctic zone in Sweden and have been closer to those communities, but perhaps never to the deep degree that I'm hearing from Acacia. I find it fascinating and really interesting to listen to her talk about it. And I'm also learning by just listening.
Yeah, likewise. I think, Acacia, we joked about it earlier about all the misconceptions about Alaska. And I think that extends to the Arctic. And everybody thinks of it as this place that no one ever sets foot on except when a National Geographic photographer goes there. And we kind of have such a watered down, misconceived view of it. And this kind of puts a way different light on it, especially seeing it from the different perspectives. I want to go into storytelling. Jonas, you kind of opened it up there talking about your storytelling. Sounds like it's a different approach to storytelling, obviously just based on the subject matter. So Jonas, can you talk about what storytelling means to you as it relates to this region? And then Acacia, after Jonas, I want to talk to you about your approach to storytelling.
Absolutely. I think in nature photography, many of the most powerful photographs, many of the most beautiful photographs, they don't tell stories at all. as photographers, we're inundated with everyone telling us that we have to tell stories through our images. And I think in nature photography, that's not entirely true. Photographs of human subjects tell stories. Photographs of man-made objects, structures, things tell stories. Photographs of animals can tell stories. Or I should say, I think the viewers of these photographs will interpret the photograph, or they'll see a story that is connected to their own human experience. But sometimes photos really don't tell stories like landscapes. If we take a pure landscape, there's no roads or buildings or other man-made objects. There are no humans for which we to ask the question, who is this person? Why is that person there? What is that person doing? There's no wildlife where we can say, oh my God, that bear looks cold or wet or hungry or happy. There's just pure landscapes. And I don't think there are any stories there. We can put stories on that. We can say that this is the story of how a little seed became a tree, and the tree, et cetera, and the ecosystem and the story of life. But I think that is us trying too hard. If we just enjoy photographs of, let's say, landscapes, I think what we all do is feel something. Pure landscape imagery evokes a lot of emotions. It makes the viewer feel something. I think this is what I always want to achieve through my photography. I'm not so fussed about storytelling in most of my images. I'm really fussed, however, about plucking the heartstrings. As I'm taking my photographs, already then envisage what the viewer should or will feel from my own perspective when they see my images. Will they feel calm, peaceful, tired, happy, glad, whatever it is? Because these emotions, they are the start of change. I consider myself not so much of a documentarian photographer as I consider myself an artist. And I like that idea because I believe art can make people change who they are, change what they think, accept something that they don't know, and learn something. I need to circle this in the little wrapper that is conservation, because I like to think that most of my images are within the conservation niche, but not necessarily within the traditional documentarian conservation niche where we take pictures of stuff, show them to people and say, this is what's happening. You know, this is the drought in Africa and the wildlife is dying and all this stuff. That's not what I'm trying to do with my photography. I would rather see the emotions that I try to evoke with my images as something where we bridge a kind of like physical distance between humans and nature, because as humans, we only protect what we love, and we only love what we know. And since the majority of humans now live in big cities far removed from nature, nature has become dangerous. It has become mystical. It has become scary. And if nature is scary and dangerous and far away from us in our daily lives, we're not going to protect it because we don't know it, we don't love it. But I believe that by evoking emotions in humans when they see my images, maybe they'll say, oh my God, that's a beautiful place. I would like to see that for myself. And I believe that directly can lead to conservation, protection of wild spaces in the world. You see, this is not about storytelling for me. This is about conservation through art, conservation through emotions, and actually really intentionally trying to make people feel something.
Wow, such a profound take. It's almost poetic. Again, everything you guys talk about, it's like I feel like I'm listening to live poetry.
That was very beautiful.
Well, I've thought about this for years because as I was growing in my photography career, I kept being told you have to tell stories. And I kept not understanding it because I didn't see any stories in my images. And I felt like a failure for years in my career as a photographer. Even when I was successful and making a living as a photographer, I kept thinking that I'm failing because I don't see any stories in my images. What am I doing wrong? How can I make it different? And that's when it hit me that it doesn't need to be stories. It can be something completely different.
You're not making stories, you're making icons.
Perhaps.
Yeah, that is such an interesting take. It's like, let the landscape do itself. And this word feeling keeps coming up and talking about you're really taking a feeling, something you feel when you see this. And I think in both of your work, this theme is not just about, hey, I'm taking a beautiful picture. Hey, this is a beautiful landscape. It's really talking about capturing an emotion, capturing a feeling, Acacia, you talked about not taking a photo, but making a photo, especially in terms of large format photography, where it's doing justice to the landscape.
I think that what Jonas has shared is really important, especially in environments like he described, where storytelling is really, really pushed and encouraged. And I know I'm often asked to talk about storytelling and how to tell stories with pictures because I've had a lot of success with it and it's allowed me to work in the editorial space, etc. But I think for me as well, like deep down, what I want to do is to make people feel with my pictures. I think for any aspiring or early career photographers who might be listening today, deciding whether or not to pursue storytelling very directly or to take a more like conceptual and emotional approach, is ultimately a really personal decision and also a little bit related to simply where you want your photos to exist in the world. Like for me, learning to tell stories has, maybe led to having to include some photos that I don't find quite as emotionally resonant and amazing, but it creates a narrative and that allows them to be published in magazines and newspapers, etc. Whereas a series that is more emotional, conceptual, less story focused can still be an incredible fit for, an exhibition or a book or other ways that photos can exist in the world. So I think that all of these approaches are valid in their own ways.
I agree with that as well. I think it's important to not see what I said as the only truth. It's perhaps my truth, but I think that story-driven image series can be so incredibly powerful and themselves, of course, evoke a lot of emotions. So I think to each their own in this. And I think, there's truth to both sides. And I think one just has to figure out where they want to be in the world, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, listening to you describe that, Jonas, made me think back to my earliest series when I was first starting to work in the Arctic and working very much in the way that you described. It made me feel like, I want to go back to that. That felt so true and incredible.
I think it's hard, though.
It is hard. It's very
because
hard.
The channel, the commercial viability for such images, I believe, is much lower than stuff that can be published in magazines and stories that really resonate with people. It's not saying that that's easy either, but I think there's a wider acceptance of such images.
That's a whole nother interesting topic that you guys kind of opened up and made me think about just the financials of getting here. Does that play into the demand for what types of images are coming out of these expeditions? And, how are people normally getting up to these regions? Does all the logistical inclusions play into what kind of stories are coming out of here? Or how does that all work?
Oh, absolutely. Polar regions are most often extremely expensive to get to, especially Antarctica. For the most part, I think most people visit by ship. Some people fly in, but at enormous expense and often for a short period of time. And in the Arctic as well, like in Arctic Canada, which I've been speaking about, just the airfare to get there can be like $5,000. And the cost of groceries are astronomical. It's like $18 for a box of cookies. And so for me, the logistics of getting to places factors tremendously into everything that I do. Like a big part of my workflow is applying for grants for the projects I want to do because there's no way that I could ever afford to do that on my own. And that is actually one of the reasons why I spent so long guiding, was because that was a way that I could physically get to those places and actually get paid to do so, where I never would have been able to afford probably even a single trip down there as a tourist. And I do think that the expense of getting there is a big reason why we read in the editorial world statistically less stories about those regions, because it is just so costly to get there. And of course, the solution to that is hiring local photographers, which is a whole other topic. But just some thoughts on that.
I think in Sweden, the way I grew up, it's very different. The Arctic is incredibly accessible in Sweden. $200 train ticket gets you there and gets you back from the southern Sweden to the very north. I could probably complete a 20-day expedition with skis and pulk at maximum $50 per day if I already own all the gear. But even if I have to rent half the gear, maybe my budget will be $60, $70 a day if I camp out in the Arctic winter. It can be done extremely cheaply in Sweden. And that's how I did it for the first 10 years of exploring the Arctic, because back then there was no chance that I would get to, let's call it the proper Arctic. And the Arctic in Sweden is still proper, but if you want to get further north, if you want to get to more remote places, yes, it is incredibly expensive. We're talking to hire a ship, $100,000 for a 10-day expedition or more to get into the Arctic. And then you need to fly there. You have to have the gear. It's a complicated process like nothing else. But, those are very separate things. I have never experienced the Arctic in North America. And from what I'm hearing, it sounds complicated, but my experience of getting to the Arctic in Sweden, at least, is that it's a piece of cake. But once you're there, well, you have to work hard to survive, to stay warm, to try to stay happy, to be able to create. But actually getting there is fairly easy in Sweden.
So I just grew up on the wrong continent, is what you're telling me.
Not at all.
I've had this whole view. It's like, man, I'll never get there. I just should have moved to Sweden.
Jonas, I'm curious, just to delineate the differences between the northern parts of Sweden and the proper Arctic, like you said. Is there a big difference in your mind in those places? Are they separate regions?
They are, mostly because of the risk profile for me personally. Mm-hmm. As an expedition leader that makes commercial tours and take people to the Arctic on a regular basis, my work always starts with a risk assessment. Creating a tour in Arctic Sweden by, let's say, cross-country skis and a pulk and a tent, I can control the risk to a very, very large degree. There are no predators in the winter in Sweden that you need to think about. Of course, we have wolverines and lynxes and Arctic foxes, although I would call that a scavenger, but they're not going to pose any risk or harm to humans. So the only risk you have to think about for humans is the extreme conditions in wintertime, wind, cold. And these last couple of years, rain has become a problem because I've been out skiing and all of a sudden we've had thaws that 20 years ago would never have happened in the wintertime. And all of a sudden you can't move because you're literally surrounded by lakes of open water that shouldn't exist, but now does exist. So, but the risks are very manageable. And then when I do my expeditions up in Svalbard and Greenland, you're surrounded by predators, polar bears, mostly. You are much further from rescue services. If something happens to you, rescue could be hours, days away from where you are. Whereas in Sweden, of course, it can still be hours and days depending on the weather, but normally it is not. It could be a snowmobile coming to pick you up in a couple of hours. It could be a helicopter being there in half an hour if you're lucky, if the weather is good. That doesn't necessarily happen in the same way if you're in Svalbard or Greenland, places that I work. So the risk profile is, for me, very different. The logistical challenges of getting there and staying safe are extremely different. I can put together an expedition in Arctic Sweden in a couple of hours, but it will take me a couple of weeks or even a couple of months to do it in Svalbard or Greenland. So the proper comes from the risk perspective.
Jonas, I want to stay right there and talk more in detail, specifically the expedition you organized in 2022 to mark the 150th anniversary of the Swedish Polar Expedition. Can you talk about what it took to really get that from the conception of the idea to making it happen? Can you talk about the hurdles, the planning that went into it?
Well, it started with COVID.
A lot of great stories the last 5 years started that way.
Yeah, I think so. So COVID hit. My wife and I were sitting in the living room. We had just canceled a whole year worth of paid work, refunded all our guests, and we were both feeling incredibly low. We had no idea what we were going to do in the coming year. What would the future hold if you're working in expeditions and all of a sudden you can't go anywhere? So we sat there and we're like, okay, what do we do? We had no answer to that. So I picked up a book about Professor Adolf Erik Nordenskiöld and his 1872 to 1873 Arctic expedition. And I started reading. And I got mesmerized by this book. And the more I read, the more I was like, oh my God, this is the journey of a lifetime. Everything that could go wrong on his expedition went wrong. His expedition was originally to be first to reach the North Pole. It took him a lot of effort to get up to northern Svalbard, where they were supposed to overwinter and then head up north. They were supposed to travel by dog sleds, but there was a dog plague in Greenland, so they couldn't buy any dogs. So instead, they brought Swedish reindeers together with indigenous Swedish Sami people to manage the reindeers on the expedition. But the first thing that happened when they arrived in Svalbard is that 39 of the 40 reindeers escaped. So they only had one reindeer left called Christer, and he was now the token reindeer on the expedition and pretty pointless because he couldn't really do anything alone. So they had no means of transporting themselves to the North Pole. But, proper expedition in the 1800s, they tried anyway. But they couldn't get north because there was just too much ice, too much snow. They couldn't push the sleds because they were too heavy. So they came back to where they had started and like, okay, what do we do now? Well, as entrepreneurial expedition leaders, they decided to be the first expedition to explore the Northeastland, which is one of the bigger islands in the Svalbard archipelago. They did a huge expedition over 2 months. Everything went wrong. They almost didn't survive, but eventually they got back, they got home, and with them, they packed a unheard of scientific research of the climate, of marine biology, of stuff that no one had ever seen before from this undiscovered island that was the Nordøstlandet in Norwegian. And that itself was a huge success. They came back to Sweden as some kind of Arctic heroes, and at least in Swedish history, Professor Nordenskiöld is ranked as a Shackleton of the world, as one of the great polar explorers. And I sat and I read this book 148 years later, and I was like, this is incredible. Maybe I could redo this on the 150-year jubilee 2 years into the future. So that's how all of it started. My wife thought I was crazy at first. She probably still thinks that. But I started looking at how can I logistically make this? Is the route still possible today? If I do it now, how can I also bring, just as Nordenskiöld did, a scientific team with me? So I started looking at what kind of scientists would I want to have with me. I would like to have an Earth system scientist or a climate researcher. I want to have a glaciologist with me, maybe even a historian. And I started basically sketching on this project and putting together a proposal, which was obviously absolutely crazy because I've never done anything like that before. So I started fundraising. For 18 months, I fundraised for this project. And initially, people thought that I was absolutely crazy and no one wanted to fund me. And then I found in one of the footnotes of the book that the person that funded Adolf Erik Nordenskiöld's 1872 expedition, he had started a Swedish bank, Carnegie Investment Bank. And that bank was still in existence. So I was like, why don't I contact the bank? And I sent them an email telling, well, the guy who founded your bank, he funded this expedition 150 years ago. Let's redo it now on the Jubilee. Of course, they loved the idea. So all of a sudden, I had my first sponsor coming in with a big chunk of the capital that I needed. And after that, fundraising was really easy. And I got funded by another 20 outdoor brands with equipment that I needed. And I thought now everything is easy. Okay, then I needed to find a team of researchers. Of course, I didn't have the budget to pay them. So I needed a team of researchers that were willing to do this just because it was a cool thing to do, to go and do research in the Arctic whilst being surrounded by the Arctic winter, polar bears, and an enormous amount of risk. I must have interviewed at least 40 different scientists, and most of them laughed at me. They said, this is crazy. But in the end, I found some people that were just as wild as I was. Dr. Susanna Hancock, earth scientist, and Erik Huss, a glaciologist from Sweden. And all of a sudden, I had 2 scientists that were willing to come with me. Next, I thought I need to get a film crew ready for this as well. So I managed to find a filmmaker and a director of photography that were willing to do a crazy project like this. I realized that as a sole guide, I couldn't run this project alone. I needed at least a second guide because we're in polar bear country. We need to be armed and aware 24 hours a day so we don't get eaten by polar bears. So I found another guide who was willing to come on it. And all of a sudden, we were a team of 6. We had another 7 interns that were helping out to make the project a reality with logistics and planning. And it turned into a massive undertaking in a way that I had never imagined. And of course, now it all sounds easy, but then we started looking at logistics. Professor Nordenskiöld had started from northern Svalbard, a place called Mossel Bay, where he overwintered in a hut called Polheim. How do you get there in wintertime? First, we looked at ships, but no ship can really go there in winter because the sea is frozen. So we started looking at helicopters, but one helicopter ride would cost me double the budget that I had raised, so that was impossible. We went through probably around 20 different logistics suppliers. Half of them told me I was crazy, that I should give up on the idea. The other half quoted me money that was so outrageous that I could never afford to pay it. Eventually, I got a team of crazy snowmobile drivers to drive us up 14 hours through the Arctic winter with all the gear we needed to get there. And then at least I thought that the logistics was solved. We end up getting our expedition permit through the government in Svalbard. It took a lot of time and it was a lot of complications. I flew to Svalbard with 27 pieces of luggage, including guns and ammunition and food and everything you can imagine. 2 boxes were lost, so we all of a sudden had no skis when we arrived in Svalbard. It was nightmare after nightmare. I basically was a lot over budget, to the extent that I put personal capital into the project before we even set off on the expedition, because by now I was so committed that nothing could convince me that we should cancel, even though everything went wrong. Because I felt like Professor Adolf Erik Nordenskiöld. For him, everything went wrong, and he did it anyway. And I thought, even if everything goes wrong with me, I can still do it. I was so committed. Anyway, off we go. The expedition starts, and I'm so exhausted from 1.5 years of planning and fundraising and logistics that I hardly knew my name when we started the expedition. But off we went, and we managed to get away. But I have never planned anything harder before. It's the most challenging thing I've ever done in my life, getting the logistics organized for this expedition.
Wow.
And a walk in the park.
No, it's not.
I know who to call if I need anything planned. I mean, it's got to be the most difficult kind of, we stress out about going away for the weekend, and that's another level altogether. Well, this seems like a good time to take a short break. Let's stand up, stretch, shake it out. If you're already standing, have a seat, relax. When we come back, we'll shift the conversation to gear as well as other aspects of photographing in polar regions with Acacia Johnson and Jonas Paurell.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of the B&H Photography Podcast. Before we continue our chat, we've got 2 words to share with you. Build Expo. Join us at the Javits Center in New York on June 17th and 18th for the most electrifying live event of the year, and it's absolutely free to attend. Featuring more than 100 speakers across photography, filmmaking, and content creation, Build Expo invites creators of all levels and types to connect, create, and experience the technology shaping the future of visual and storytelling arts. You also get hands-on access to check out the latest gear from over 300 top brands. For more information and to register, head on over to buildexpo.com or click the link in the podcast show notes. And now, back to the show.
And we are back with Acacia Johnson and Jonas Paurell. And now that we have a basic understanding of polar landscapes and a little bit of background on your respective projects, let's get into the specifics of preparations for a polar expedition and the camera gear you pack. So Acacia, let's start with you. What is your go-to camera system? What do you bring in on a typical expedition?
So it varies a little bit depending on the project. The weight of gear is generally one of my biggest considerations. I like to have everything in a backpack that I can carry for many hours hiking, etc. And I'm not like a huge muscular person, so I can't bring too much stuff. But usually I carry 2 Canon camera bodies, depending on what I'm doing. It could be like a 5D system, or I also have an R5 and an R3. And 2 to 4 lenses, and then sometimes I'll carry a film camera as well. And because, as mentioned, the comfort of carrying it is really important, I really like to have crossbody slings for my cameras, like a double camera harness, if I'm especially around like wildlife or environments where things can happen quite quickly. I like to have like a wide angle lens and a zoom lens physically on my person. And I also really like polarizing filters for increasing the intensity of colors in the sky, as well as removing surface reflections from water. It makes like a huge difference. Part of the reason that I use those is that I historically have always lost my lens caps after about 5 minutes of ever trying to use one. And so having some protection on my lenses is like super important to me. And I know one time I made an Instagram post about this and I got these like passionate messages from photographers like, well, why would you put lesser quality glass in front of your perfect lens? But like realistically on many of my photo projects, I've kind of only talked about one, but many of my photo assignments are expeditions in their own right, where I'm completely out in a remote area for the entirety of the trip. And if something happens to that lens, there's no chance of a replacement. And so having filters on the front of my lenses kind of takes the pressure off. I can like roll around in the tundra or whatever and not freak out about it accidentally getting scratched.
You got to love the internet. It's like you're out there, no repairs for 6 days away, and someone's like, isn't that an inferior piece of glass on your
Like, no, I need it.
Yeah, it's like you do your own lens repairs out there. So
Yeah.
I know we've all had the filter, you ding your lens and the filter gets stuck and you're like, oh no, it's cross-threaded now.
Yeah, I just bought one of those things to pull it off when it's cross-threaded, because that's a pain.
Mm-hmm.
Essential. What about you, Jonas? What's your go-to system? And again, same as Acacia, what do you normally bring on a typical expedition?
It really depends. I don't think there's any one go-to bag. Like, first of all, am I on a ship? In which case I can bring the entire kitchen sink, the fridge, and some other stuff. Or am I self-powered? Am I skiing across the Arctic? Is it summer? Is it winter? All this matters. But for a typical ship-based expedition, which is perhaps the first experience a lot of people would have up in the high Arctic, I shoot Sony and have for many years. For me, the typical landscape kit is somewhere between 16 and 200 mil full frame. That's typically what I bring for landscape photography wherever I go. So I bring a 16-35 f4. I don't use 2.8 lenses at all when it comes to zoom because they're just heavy, I find. I bring the new 20-70 from Sony, which I think is just a fantastic focal length. And often that's the only lens I really bring because it's so versatile. Also an f4 lens. And then I bring a 100-400 or a 70-200 to round that out for landscape. If I'm also doing wildlife, my go-to lens is the 400-8 together with the 1.4 teleconverter. Like Acacia, I bring 2 camera bodies, A7R Mark V. Typically I use for landscape. And recently I have replaced some other old cameras with the new A1 Mark II, which is a game changer for wildlife photography. 30 frames per second in raw, pre-capture, all this stuff. Like, you're never missing images again. It's absolutely fantastic. And it has increased my hit rate a large margin when I do faster wildlife like birds and stuff like this. If it's landscape, I always bring a lightweight travel tripod. If it's long days of wildlife photography, I typically bring a monopod. It's not complicated gear, really. If I'm heading up into the winter, I always bring some kind of weather protection. I have one of those think tank emergency rain covers that comes with me on every expedition, especially if I'm on skis, because if you get the equipment wet and you're dealing with condensation inside, outside, that's the kind of stuff that ruins your photography very quickly. You can even get condensation on gear inside a tent versus outside a tent in the winter. So I take a lot of precautions about that. But generally, it's not complicated stuff. It's the same stuff that landscape and wildlife photographers would use anywhere.
Mm-hmm. I would think the accessories and everything outside of the camera gear is probably the more important. Like, how are you staying warm? How are you staying dry? Is there any must-have that people don't think of? Or is there one thing that is the first thing on your list, like, I cannot forget this?
Original manufacturing batteries. This goes back 10 years ago. It might not be true anymore. But I did an expedition. It was minus 28 Celsius. What's that? Minus 18 or something Fahrenheit. It was cold, bitterly cold. I was shooting Nikon back in those days, and my Nikon batteries gave me about 300 shots per charge per battery. And I had some cheaper, non-original manufacturing batteries. They gave me on average 20 shots. So 20 versus 300 made me very upset. So since then, I only buy original batteries, and you don't keep them in a cold bag. You keep them in a Ziploc bag in a pocket somewhere so they stay nice and toasty so that you don't ever freeze your batteries. That's really the only thing you really, really have to care about when it comes to what gear to bring. Other than that, I think that processes for managing condensation are much more important than the gear you bring.
I absolutely second that. I get a lot of questions about gear, and I often kind of try to deflect the questions deliberately away from what exact camera model and stuff, because I think there are so many different brands and lenses and cameras that are fantastic. They're excellent. But really, the most important things for me as well are having enough batteries, keeping the camera dry. One thing I often really emphasized when I was guiding and we were on ships going out in zodiacs all the time is having a truly watertight bag to keep your camera in if you're crossing bodies of water.
I agree with that. I use these kind of kayaking bags. I don't have a camera branded backpack. I use literally bags made for water travel.
What about gloves? Do you have recommendations or types of gloves with a thin membrane where you can feel buttons? Or do you just have muscle memory at a certain point?
I bring probably 5 pairs of gloves when I go on expedition.
Okay.
I love the Swedish brand Hestra, which is just outdoor brand. It's nothing camera specific. But what I love about it is that it's a layering system, like all your outdoor clothing when you're in the Arctic or anywhere. You have inner gloves, you have middle gloves, you have outer gloves. Some of them are waterproof, some of them are not. So it's hugely flexible and it just works. Gloves is super important, but also being nimble when you're shooting is often equally important. But again, it comes back to the process, as you're saying, being nimble and muscle memory. That's it. Like a lot of my guests are struggling with their photography up in the Arctic when it's cold, when their hands are cold, when it's hurting, when they're uncomfortable, when they're tired, when they're hungry, because being up there in the cold is hard. And you need to know your camera so well that what you're doing is like an idiot-proof process. You can't make mistakes because you've done it a million times before. You know everything inside and out. And that's much, again, more important than the gear itself.
Mm-hmm. Acacia, I'm interested on the large format camera, because I know for me to bring out a large format camera, I'm like, all right, I better get every frame. When we go through that, I'm going out. What do I need to bring? What can I live without? Do I really have to have this? What is the decision making that goes on when bringing the large format camera on an expedition?
I used the large format camera almost exclusively a little earlier in my career when I was first starting out. And I love using it. I love how slow it is, how intentional it is, and every picture that you make, you're just so committed to. There's no other opportunity. I will say, in addition to that, I would also shoot backups with a digital camera of those pictures as well after one heartbreaking trip where I shot exclusively film, and actually there had been an error with the camera and I lost like 90% of my negatives. So that was the primary use of my digital camera early on. Now I use it a lot more, but using the large format, people often assume that it would be more difficult, like in deep cold conditions. And actually, I found it to be a little bit easier because the camera doesn't have any batteries or any electronics, and the 4x5 sheet film doesn't need to bend. There was really no risk, and it wouldn't get slowed down. It worked exactly the same way. The film couldn't shatter if it got super cold. And for reference, for example, on the Arctic Winter Project that I described, the average daily temperature was between 30 and 45 degrees below zero. So it was very, very deep cold. But the 4x5 worked wonderfully. The only complication, like Jonas has mentioned, was managing condensation coming in and out of warm places. But the digital cameras, I'd keep all kinds of extra batteries really close to my skin on some like inner pocket and often be cycling them through. One day when it was really cold, the autofocus froze, which I didn't know could happen until then. But the 4x5 was great, honestly. You just have to tolerate the uncertainty of not knowing what you've got for, in some cases, a couple of months.
Jonas, you had mentioned that you have a specific process for managing condensation.
If you're in a warm hut somewhere and you go out to shoot, no problems. Your camera can handle that perfectly. But if you go from cold too warm, it can basically break your whole camera. What happens basically is all the humidity inside that warm place condensates on the cold camera, but not just on the outside, also on the inside. So your entire camera, if you bring it from minus 20 Celsius or whatever into a warm room, it's going to basically be dripping with water. And it's also dripping with water inside the camera if you're unlucky. So what you need to do is to leave it in an airtight, insulated bag. So a camera backpack is perfect for this. Don't touch your camera for 2 hours inside that camera bag as you return to a ship or a hut or whatever it is. Another way of managing it when I'm on a really long Arctic expedition is I never take my camera inside. I leave it outside and let it be cold. I'll just take my memory cards and my batteries inside to run backups and charge batteries, but I leave the rest of the gear outside. And other than that, it's not much to it. The only thing you have to remember is if your batteries are frozen, you want them to be defrosted ideally before you start charging them, because otherwise they can break. But it's not complicated, but you just have to be very strict with this because it can ruin your entire camera gear.
Cool. Is there any tips or tricks for going up in these regions? I mean, the cold is one thing, but I think it's the desolation and the detachment from, hey, I can go to the store and get this if I need it. Based on you guys' experience, any tips or tricks for not running into things that might be a deal breaker, given where you are, that may not be catastrophic if you're just going to a national park?
I think probably just having a little bit of extra gear on all fronts is generally how I approach it. When it comes to lenses, I like to have a number of different lengths, and especially ones that zoom between different focal lengths. Like my favorite one is the 24 to 105 or a 100 to 400, so that I'm never ending up in a situation where I've committed to something that suddenly doesn't work for what's happening. And then tons of extra batteries, extra battery chargers, memory cards, and also stuff to clean camera gear. One of the biggest crisis points that I occasionally saw happen for guests on polar voyages was getting dust on the sensor. And often that feels like something that you need to go to like a camera shop to get fixed. And myself and some other guides would travel with sensor cleaning kits, which feels like a very delicate operation, but in fact, it's really not so hard. And knowing that you have that, and if the worst thing happens, we can fix it, is an enormous peace of mind.
On my last expedition, which was Galapagos, I think I cleaned at least 5 sensors in a week.
Wow.
Amazing.
Seriously, I'm scared to even touch mine and being out there. And it's mission critical at that point. If you screw something up or scratch something.
But you don't really, because you're not cleaning the sensor, you're cleaning a protective glass that sits over the sensor. So nothing is really going to happen to it if you know what you're doing. And, you just need some swabs, you need some liquid, a blower, and that's really it. Once you learn to do it and you realize it takes about 120 seconds to clean a sensor, you're good to go. It becomes very easy. You get over that hurdle of fear for damaging equipment because you're not going to damage it if you know what you're doing.
I want to talk about managing expectations on a trip like this. You guys are obviously very seasoned. You have experience as photographers and as guides, which I think opens up a whole new level of experience and knowledge that people might not bring. And for people who are traveling to regions like this, it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing for a lot of people and a never-in-a-lifetime thing for a lot of people. It's something that people will aspire to their entire lives. Can you talk through your experience more as guides than as photographers for misconceptions people have when planning these trips, or really just if someone wants to go, what is the experience like? How would you describe it, and how would you recommend that people prepare themselves for it?
The first thing that comes to mind for me is really taking the time to research exactly where the trip is going and also what you're likely to see at that particular season. In many of the trips that I did, the wildlife sightings and likelihood of seeing things would change dramatically almost from week to week, or certainly from month to month. And sometimes we would have guests who were practically experts. They were so passionate and well researched and well read, and they were incredible to travel with. And then sometimes we would have guests who really didn't even know where they were on a map. So those expectations could be a little bit harder to manage, but with just a little bit of internet research, you can really understand, like, oh, are the penguins going to have chicks if I come at this time of year? Or will there still be snow on the ground, or will it be melted? Will the birds have come back? Like, those are all kind of things to think about. And also, I think in the Arctic in particular, understanding that while places like Svalbard, for example, have incredible abundance of Arctic wildlife and it's really well protected there, it is spread out over an enormous area. So it can take a lot of time. For example, to find a single polar bear can take days in some cases, and then it might be a couple of miles away throughout that sighting. Other times, you might have one come walking up to the ship, but it is completely dependent on the individual experience. And so I think going into a trip with kind of a sense of exploration, like the joy of the trip is that you don't know, and it's completely unique to your experience. And whatever you do see is kind of a gift.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, I always try to tell myself I have to underpromise and overdeliver on all these things, because you're not working in a zoo. You can never predict what the wildlife is going to do. Of course, if you go to the Galapagos, you know you're going to see all of it because it's everywhere. The wildlife is so abundant. But if you go to the Arctic, it's not. I'll tell you a little anecdote. Last year, I was leading an expedition. I had another two pro photographers with me, Thomas Heaton and Simon D'Entremont, two well-known names, as guest leaders on the tour. And we had a bunch of clients. And we'd had already 3 days or so of moving around, not seeing any polar bears. And one of the guys up on the bridge spotted a polar bear like 3 kilometers off in the distance. And I went up, had a look, and it's indeed actually 2 polar bears, a mother and a juvenile, and they are sleeping. So they are 3K away sleeping. You cannot take a picture of that. It's 4 pixels or something yellow fluffy in the snow. So I made the decision to drop anchor and to wait and to wait and to wait. At one point, the captain of the ship came to me and was like, Jonas, should we not launch some activities? We have to do something. I said, nope, we're going to wait. And we waited. We waited for almost 24 hours. And in this period, I went through a crisis where I wondered if my decision was right, because a polar bear who has just fed and is lying down sleeping can sleep for a long, long, long time. And when they wake up, there's no guarantee that they will move to the edge of the ice or something. They might just disappear into the mountains. But I just said, we wait. And I had almost a mutiny amongst the ship. I asked my fellow pros, Thomas and Simon, what's your take on this? And they're like, just go with your instinct and trust your knowledge. And I did, and we waited. Finally, I think it was just after midnight, the guy who had the watch on the bridge called my cabin, Jonas, they're moving. I went up, had a look, and they were edging closer to the ice, and I could see there was a huge weather pattern coming in. We could see snow, fog, everything just rolling in from behind the polar bears. And this is the middle of the night. All the guests are happily sleeping. So basically, I grab the comms and blaring out in the entire ship, I tell everyone, you have 15 minutes to be in the Zodiac. If you're not in the Zodiac in 15 minutes, you'll be left behind and you can keep sleeping. We have activity, and this is our only chance. So more than half the ship made it to the Zodiac. A couple of people didn't. And that was the worst decision of their photography lives, because we had the best polar bear photography session I've had in my entire life. Polar bears, maybe 80 meters from the Zodiacs, a mother and a cub playing and swimming in the incredible, beautiful Arctic Ocean. And we were just photographing in this incredible still weather where the snow is falling down on us. And we were out there for almost 2 hours shooting. It was ethereal, surreal, and unbelievably beautiful. But the expectations from the guests is that you come and you have an action-packed day. But instead, I forced everyone to sit on their butt and do nothing for 24 hours, waiting for this moment that might not have happened. And dealing with those expectations is everything. And I do that early on. I basically tell all my guests that some days are going to be nothing, some days are going to be bad, some days are not going to be delivering. And that gives you the opportunity as a leader, I think, to have some wiggle room and to take chances where you might get something from wildlife. And for me, these moments are the moments that you remember as a guide forever.
What's the closest you can get to wildlife in a Zodiac craft?
Starting this season, in cub season now, you have to stay 500 meters away from polar bears. If the bears approach you, you need to back off to 500 meters. And in summer and autumn season, winter season, it's now 300 meters distance from polar bears. At those kind of distances, you can just as well shoot from the deck, I would say, in Svalbard, because it doesn't really matter if you're 2 meters off the ocean or if you're right down eye level with them and they're at that distance. But for sure, in any other place where they don't have these new regulations, the Zodiacs are everything. You are eye level with your subjects, and that's what you need to be when you're photographing wildlife.
And for our listeners, Zodiac is a generic term for these inflatable or semi-inflatable dinghies.
It's like Jeep, right? We all call Jeep for our 4x4 vehicle. Zodiac is a brand, actually, but you're absolutely right. It's inflatable crafts that you use to get around, navigate through the ice. They are incredibly strong and they don't break easily, and you can go through, quite a lot of sea ice without them being punctured,
Yeah, it's a very sturdy inflatable rubber boat, essentially, with an outboard motor on the back. And I think for the majority of Arctic expedition ship travel, like cruise ship travel, that's the primary way that guests will get off of the ship to go ashore or to go cruise around and see things across the Arctic and the Antarctic. It's like that's the boat that's usually used.
By the way, are icebergs still a threat? Or do you have navigation technologies that have mitigated that?
It has happened in the last, 20 years through just, kind of random occurrences of moments of oversight or decision making. But in general, ships have really robust radar systems to be able to see ice and slow down in ice areas at night, for example, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and there's always someone on the bridge looking as well.
And then there's special ships that are icebreakers that are, I guess, immune to these disasters, but those aren't the types of vessels that you're on, right?
It depends. So all the ships up in the high Arctic and Antarctic will have some level of ice classing. You would never have tourists on an icebreaker. So they would be on an ice class ship, which is typically renovated vessels that have been used for either research, fishing industries, or transport of goods up in the Arctic. So typically these days renovated for tourism activities, but they are very, very sturdy ships that are ice classed and can handle going through X amount of sea ice. So they're very sturdy, very capable ships with a lot of safety protocols and safety features that make them perfectly suitable to go in those environments. The downside is that they're typically flat-hulled, which means if it's a storm and it's rolling, they're not very comfortable ships to be in.
I have actually traveled on an icebreaker once on a tourist expedition. They're not very common because there aren't that many of them. But occasionally they can be used, for example, for ship expeditions to the North Pole. The 100 Years of Victory, I think, is a nuclear icebreaker that used to do those trips pretty often. And I went on another one called the Captain Klebnikov that had a rounded hull, and man, did that thing roll in the weather. I actually think the motion of the flat hull is also uncomfortable in a different way, but that was a very special ship. But they're most commonly used for scientific purposes, I would say.
I want to go back to this idea of stripping expectations. As you guys both had mentioned, you don't know what you're going to get. You may get polar bears, you may not. You don't know what is going to take place until you're there and you're in it and it's happening. Acacia, you have talked in the past about this importance of developing an authentic connection to a place. Now, pairing that with this idea of stripping expectations and going in with kind of like a fresh mind, what advice would you give to people to help them cultivate such a connection? Or how do you develop this authentic connection to a place that you don't know until you're there?
That's a tricky question to concisely put into words. I think everybody's connection is going to be really different, of course. But if you're going to a new place for the first time and you don't have a huge amount of time to be there, I think that, reading up, learning as much as you can about it before you get there will help to have a little bit of a personal understanding of the significance of the things that you are seeing. Also, taking time when you're there to be learning from the people around you who may be experts whatever that looks like, whether that's local people or if that's the guides that you're traveling with. But the more understanding we have of the places we're in, there's this kind of depth that starts accumulating, and the pictures can kind of start feeling like more than just a picture of a landscape, right? But also, even though this all we've been talking about is about photography, taking some time where you are to really just be there and be present without taking pictures, I think is really important to really understand, what the experience means to you personally. Because I think in the beginning stages of being in a new place where you haven't spent a ton of time, that personal connection is something that you're just establishing, and doing that without the camera can be really valuable. Some of my best memories of my early guide years were in a time when we didn't yet have satellite internet, and people would come on the ships and they would all be on their phones and all be anxious about being away from their email. And this anxiety would go on palpably for like 2 days. And then we would be out there and people would just totally relax, and they would be so present, looking each other in the eye, just completely taking everything in. And that was where the transformation happened. Being present is everything.
I so agree with that. If you're a photographer, you want to depict a place or a wildlife or a behavior or whatever it is, right? You have to understand it first. And you cannot understand anything with preconceived ideas, because nothing in the real world is the same as what you read in a book or you see in a blog post. If you see images from the Arctic and you expect to see all these beautiful polar bears feeding on seals, you expect to see that every day, and you come up with all these expectations, and nothing is like that. And having an adaptability in your workflow is so important. I think that adaptability comes from first experiencing, first feeling, first understanding where you're in. I always put on the packing list to my guests that they need to bring a butt pad, one of these foam pads they can sit on, because then we can just sit down and just observe the environment that we're in, and we can really see and understand what is this place about. Because as soon as we put a camera in front of the face of a photographer, that photographer goes into the creation mode, the depicting mode, the technology mode, and they just start shooting. But it might not be the thing that they're shooting is the thing that they should be shooting. And they might not actually understand what makes the place special until they actually sit down and allow themselves to be drawn into the landscape, to the wildlife, to the environment. I echo 100% what Acacia said about this. It's so important to really connect and understand where you're at, because that is what's going to get you the images.
Oh, yeah. Do you confiscate phones? Put them in a lockbox?
Never gone that far. So many more people nowadays, bringing a phone just as their primary camera on certain types of trips, which is kind of alarming to me, but it is what it is. And embracing that technology, I think, is kind of the only way forward.
Can we talk about the changing ethics of photographing wildlife? And obviously, we know way more now than we did in past years or decades about global warming. And, the reason that you guys have really spent so much time in these regions, there's a deep connection that you have, and there's an importance that resonates with both of you. Jonas, let's start with you. We talked about the Jubilee expedition, and I want to talk about what you learned from that, or was there something that really stood out from the first expedition to the Jubilee? Can you talk about what you guys learned?
Well, I can talk about what I learned as a human being about myself and about the environment that I was in, but I think it's perhaps more interesting to talk about what the scientists learned. They came with the mission to try to recreate some of the science that was created 150 years ago, but that proved impossible for many reasons. The main number amongst those was that we couldn't take the exact same route for reasons of climate change. But They had their own research project that was supposed to be secondary that now became primary. For example, Susanna, she had a research project together with NASA where she was taking pictures of clouds from the ground. And at the same time, NASA was taking pictures with satellite of the same clouds from above to improve climate and weather prediction models, which was a hugely successful project. And Erik Huss was working with a bunch of universities to study the snowpack and glacial decline up in the Arctic. But what they came away with was an opportunity to talk to millions of people. And that's my aim. I want that every journey that I take up into these fragile regions, they should spark 100 conversations, 1,000 conversations, whatever it might be. Because even being here on this podcast, talking about depicting the Arctic, of course, we're talking about a lot of art and how we do it, but the fundamental underlying thing here is also that we're saying that the Arctic is changing. Just acknowledging that in a public space, sparking interest, talking about that we need to be aware of that. It sparks a lot of ideas in people, and these ideas can lead to change. And I think the ethic around this is changing because we're more aware now about our impact. And I think that is hugely important. My scientists, they had an opportunity to speak at COP. They spoke and lectured to over a couple of million people with online lectures about their experiences with the Jubilee expedition. I could not be more proud and happy about what they achieved using their own personal experiences on the Jubilee expedition to voice what's happening in the world and actually be able to share anecdotes that make people listen. That is a beautiful thing for me. Their change, the fact that they were able to live the climate crisis in the Arctic, the place on Earth where it's the most visible, is a huge change for them. For me personally, going into the Arctic every time, seeing ethics change doesn't change much. I just try to make the most of it every time because I know that I have a footprint, even if it is small.
Mm. And Acacia, I'm interested to hear your perspective on this. Again, this is something that you're obviously very passionate about. Can you talk about some of the changes that you've experienced in your time photographing these regions?
Certainly in my time just growing up in Alaska, the impacts of climate change are incredibly visible. For example, there's a lake, maybe a 40-minute drive from my childhood home, where a glacier once came kind of to the middle of the lake and would cab into it, and we would do like boat tours there as a kid. And that glacier is completely at the end of the valley, like there's no ice in the lake anymore. So traveling across the Arctic for all the years that I've worked there, changes are more and more visible all the time. Everybody's reporting it. Fortunately, I think that people across the world are a lot more aware of that. And so in terms of ethics, as a photographer, I think the most important thing to me is context. When I publish a photo, if it's not just operating in the kind of arts emotion space that we've talked about, which has its purposes, really describing in a detailed caption what is happening in this picture, who is this person, what is their story. Often that is like this connection point to understanding why all the changes that are happening in the Arctic matter. I think that one thing that can so often get overlooked in conservation photo stories that are about the environment and about the landscape is forgetting an element about people. Because for a certain percentage of viewers of photography, I believe, seeing pictures of just a landscape can feel remote if there's not a way to understand how that place matters to other people. So some small human element, whether it's local people in a remote place or scientists working there or visitors traveling there, something, understanding that like, oh, this is a landscape that I could theoretically set foot in. Or, oh, look, this matters to families. Those kinds of connections, I think, spark a different kind of engagement or care in audiences than just nature photos do. Context is really important to me. For example, a real pet peeve of mine is when, especially certain types of travel photographers will take pictures of people in rural places around the world. It's often pictures of like older people who have a lot of really beautiful wrinkles and expression in their faces, or cute kids that are playing in this beautiful place. And the captions are just like generalized. They haven't asked that person's name. They don't know their story. They haven't asked permission to publish that photo on the internet to be seen by thousands of people. Like, just basic human respect and interactions, I think, are really important.
It makes photography about taking.
Yeah, it's about making the picture, not taking it.
Yeah. You're almost stealing something from that human. I agree 100%. You're stealing almost. Well, you are stealing, actually. You're stealing their identity to a certain degree. But of course, that can spark a huge debate about street photography, which I'm not willing to open.
Me neither. I'm not a street photographer, and like, I don't need to go there.
Neither am I.
No, but that is such an important conversation, because it is, I think we all know what you're referring to, Acacia. We've all seen the images. We've all seen the types of tourism where it's just these contrived, set up, photo ops, and it's not going into a region and really learning. And the intention isn't to learn. The intention isn't to say, hey, I want to educate myself on another culture. It's, hey, let me try to take a picture for some clicks and some impressions online to a bunch of random strangers on the internet who I'll never meet. And I think it's more the intention or lack thereof that is so unnerving about it.
This sparks a thought in my head. Arctic polar bears. We think now that the ethics is improving because we know more about the climate crisis and the protection of the bears and et cetera, et cetera. I think to a large degree it's actually the opposite. It's worsening. And it's worsening because photography has become something quite competitive. There are all these competition photo clubs, likes on Instagram and whatnot, and it's sparking people to want to achieve a certain type of image. Specifically, if we're talking about the Arctic, about polar bears. If you want to organize a trip whereby you go into the Arctic, you slaughter seals, you throw the carcasses on the ice, and you wait for polar bears to come, I know who to talk to because I've been offered those services. And for me, that is repulsive, immoral, and simply put, wrong. I would never, ever condone such activities or organize it. But that's the reality of photography in the Arctic today in some places with some operators. I know horror stories about well-known, globally recognized photographers that participate in these kind of practices. This is not one event. This is happening because there is such public recognition, reputation, wealth to be made by getting the right shots today that people are willing to go to extreme extents to achieve those shots. I think that's something that we need to be aware of. I think that's something that we need to constantly think about when we select operators to travel with. Are they doing the right thing? Are they following best practices for conservation? The sad story is that that's not necessarily the truth. Most of them probably are, but some of them are not. And I wanted to highlight that because I've been offered this service myself and I'm just shocked by it,
Mm-hmm. Is that the impetus for those new regulations that have you staying further away from the polar bears?
This is a little bit hearsay, a little bit rumors, a little bit conversation. I spoke to some people up in Svalbard who works in research of polar bears up there. They were against the regulations because they thought it would only harm the local community in terms of tourism and making money. And they said to me that they thought that the polar bears were not really actually disturbed by boats and zodiacs being, 100 meters or so off the bears, and it wasn't a problem. And they actually in Svalbard told me that they felt that this was a kind of armchair decision from the government in Oslo, and that it was not grounded in what the local community in Svalbard wanted or what the polar bears needed. If that's true or not, I cannot say because I'm not an expert on the issue. But the regulations now are solid. If you break these rules in Svalbard, you will be fined. But the thing is, these regulations are only valid in the waters of Svalbard. I think it's 12 nautical miles outside of Svalbard. These rules no longer apply. So what I did basically this year is that I canceled all my tours. This is the first year with the new rules in Svalbard. I don't experiment with my guests when I create expeditions. I decided to take 1 or even 2 years break to see how the new rules are implemented, how the ship owners and the captains manage to navigate it, how they create the opportunities that people are coming there for, and how they stay moral within this new framework. Because from my perspective, the framework needs to be followed on my tours. And I just want to make sure that they first know how to implement it. So I've been talking to guides all through the season, guides I know up there who are still working, and not photographer guides necessarily, but expedition guides who are working on the ships. So I'm getting, snippets of stories and how it's changing the way they see polar bears. And I also hear the backstory, how they're sometimes ignoring the regulations. And I think that's the reality of commercializing something and trying to protect it. On the other hand, everyone wants to create great experiences for their guests, and conservation and sometimes sits in a second chair, which I personally don't like.
I'll agree with everything that you've shared, Jonas, about what makes ethical wildlife photography is so important too. And to me, that really connects to context, like context not only of what's happening in the image, but also how that image was made. So, for example, in probably the most highly respected wildlife photography competition, which is Wildlife Photographer of the Year, they require in submissions an extensive description of the circumstances in which that image was captured and whether or not bait was used. And of course, bait is quickly the territory in which we get into unethical wildlife photography.
It's hard to say like bird feeders.
Right.
That's the other extreme of this. I work a lot in the Amazon, in areas of the high Andes. There's a bird feeder every 2 meters, and they are restocked daily. But of course, it changes the behavior and the patterns of the birds because now they go and eat the food that is left by humans. But is that immoral if they continue it? To some degree, yes, but it's also the common practice. If you have a bird feeder in the garden and you shoot around that, is that, I know this is far removed from killing a seal and throwing it out as a carcass on the ice and waiting for polar bears, but where do we draw the line on all this, right?
Yeah, it gets very philosophical very quickly.
It does.
And equally important, where do we go from here? I mean, you guys have experience. You guys are helping shed light on the situation as it pertains to climate change and the climate crisis. What can every other individual, what can we do to help mitigate the effects of climate change?
This is the easiest and the hardest question. You need to make hard choices. As a human being, we have the power to buy from corporations that are doing the right thing, and we have the ability to vote for politicians that are going to implement rules that will force the other corporations to do the right thing. It seems, I think, for a lot of humans today that it's an impossible battle. And I can say in my own life that I'm not a saint. I don't do what is best for the climate every day of my life, and I would never pretend that I do. These are hard topics, small things, big things, and hugely challenging for us individuals. But I think the 2 most important things that we can and should do is vote for the right politicians. And second most, don't buy from corporations that you know are bad. And it's not hard to find that out. If you Google for 5 minutes, you'll get an extensive list of the worst offenders on the planet. And most of them are household brands. And it's so easy to change that. But it's also hard because our daily life takes up most of our brain capacity on a daily basis. Is about daily life and not worrying about the future. I spoke once to a climate scientist and told me, Jonas, if the climate crisis was visualized by black smoke, our world would already be fixed. But because we can't see it, because the change is so gradual, it's easy to ignore it.
Interesting.
I just want to point out that I say all these things and I try my best to live a life where I do all these things, but I'm also part of the problem. My main income comes from tourism. I literally take people on expeditions to hard to reach places, to fragile ecosystems, where we take photographs or make photographs, as you wish, of these fragile things. And that in its own sense then comes back and we inspire more people to travel to fragile ecosystems and do more. And of course, tourism is a big part of the climate crisis. It's not the biggest by any means, but it is a big part. So what I said before, I just want to reiterate. I hope that with every part of my carbon footprint that I can spark 100 conversations, because that's kind of how I see it as working in conservation whilst also being one of the offenders, because I think we're all one of the offenders. We have to do our best to create a better world. And we have to try to inspire. We have to try to spark conversations by just having a conversation around the dinner table with your family about how you are consuming things and what you can do to change things. Small things can have big impacts if there is enough volume. So I just want to say that because there is a level of hypocrisy by advocating the protection of the world and changing the world whilst also being an offender, because we're all the offender.
That's such a great sentiment to wrap up. Acacia, yeah, I want to hear your thoughts.
I just wanted to add the idea that action is so often an antidote for despair. I think that in times when what's happening in the world just seems totally overwhelming, even making some small improvement seems like, oh, what's the use? Really, doing one small thing at a time consciously, I think, can build a sense of momentum.
I love that. Dust off the bike, pump the tires, and bicycle to work one day a week. Such a tiny thing, but can you imagine the impact if we all did that?
Yeah. On a recent podcast here, a guest described a reinterpretation of anxiety that he heard from a psychologist, which is that the opposite of anxiety isn't calmness, but creativity.
I like that a lot.
I like that.
So yeah, if you're feeling a little anxious, maybe a way to help that is to think a little more expansively and take a small step.
So that's why I'm a photographer. I knew there was a reason
Me too.
out there.
Creativity and curiosity, I think. Curiosity is so embedded in all of this, and it's an essential thing to keep alive.
Yeah.
Acacia, I'm interested. I know we were wrapping the conversation up there, but I'm interested in Alaska. Again, I feel like it's cyclical. We're finishing where we started, Alaska, dispelling the myths. Simpler form of life. Is it simpler up there? And is that a common misconception about life up there? And if it is a simpler form of life and way of life up there, do you think that, I mean, when I look at everything Jonas was just describing, God forbid we don't have our next day delivery and this and that, and all this stuff that we know isn't good for the environment we're locked into, is the answer, or is one of the answers, to really just start living a simpler lifestyle and starting to get used to going back to times where we had more patience and we didn't need things now. And we, I think we all remember dial-up internet. And if somebody was on the phone, you can't get on the internet. And now, God forbid, our computer doesn't boot up in 5 seconds, we're freaking out. Is there something to be said for a simpler way of life and that getting us recalibrated?
So it's funny, throughout this whole conversation, I've been speaking mostly about places outside of Alaska. But here we are back at the beginning. And I grew up in Anchorage, which is Alaska's biggest city. So I think that for a lot of people who live here, life is pretty comparable to many other parts in the contiguous US, which we refer to as the lower 48. But what's special about Alaska is that the whole state's population is just 500,000 people. It's gigantic, and 80% of it is completely inaccessible by roads. There are many people in Alaska who do live in tiny, tiny villages off the road system. There are 229 federally recognized tribes who do, many of them live much closer to the land than we do here in Anchorage. But I think what I've gained from growing up here is simply the ease of spending more time out in nature. And a lot of people I know might have places that they like to go on a regular basis to disconnect from everything. And that is so important, I think, for mental health and also appreciation and understanding of the natural world and its value in our lives. So I want to encourage listeners, like, you don't have to live at the ends of the earth or give up everything to begin creating these meaningful connections to nature and understanding what it means to you. It can start with going on walks, going on hikes, going on a camping trip and turning your cell phone onto airplane mode and waking up to the sounds of the natural world. All of these things are so important and actually fairly tangible compared to truly living in a really remote place.
Amen. I will second that. This is a nature household. Devices, no. Take my son out to the park. One day I hope he'll appreciate that he didn't get to do the cool kid vacations, but he had like the adult vacations of going to adult places and, learning about nature, appreciating just being out there. So we can all start one thing at a time. I feel like I learned so much today. This was as interesting as it was educational. I clearly need to update my map skills. I was way off. I'm glad I had a map up during this to kind of put everything in perspective, but want to thank you both for coming on. And Acacia, we'll start with you. Any upcoming projects? Where can we learn more about your work?
So this summer, I'm going to be working primarily on a grant project back on Baffin Island in the Canadian High Arctic, but focusing on the open water season. So the time of year when there is actually not much sea ice around. And that will probably be coming out in the next couple of years. And the best places to stay updated with what I'm doing are on my Instagram page and my website. I also have started a Substack fairly recently, which I aim to keep updated, but it does take some time. So if I'm in the field, Instagram's probably the quickest way to see what I'm doing.
Awesome. And Jonas?
The biggest thing for me right now is there is something called Fotosalongen, which means the photo saloon in Sweden. It's a Hasselblad Foundation exhibition, which I have been selected to exhibit in. So I'm currently in South America and off to Sweden in a couple of weeks for the opening of this exhibition. Will run between May and September in Gothenburg, which is my first major exhibition, which I'm really, really excited about. And it's exhibiting my polar photography, which I'm really, really happy about. Other than that, I'm working on some projects in the rainforest in the Amazon around primates and planning a new one about the condor, which I find to be a fascinating bird. So those are some of the projects that I'm working on now. On top of that, of course, my expeditions around the world with my guests at Terra Photography Expeditions. But the main places to find me is obviously on Instagram and my website. And like Acacia, I just started a Substack, which I have all of one articles in.
Awesome.
So just starting that as well.
Hey, it's like we said, got to start somewhere, one small action.
Exactly.
I want to thank you both, not just for joining us today, but really for the work that you're doing. This is important work and it's not easy work. And similarly to taking action, sometimes it just takes somebody listening to a podcast episode like this to educate them on something that they didn't know much about. And that helps affect change as much as any other action can. So I want to thank you both for joining us and all the great work you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you both again. And to all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us today as well. If you are a fan of the show but are not yet a subscriber, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, B&H's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. You can also find us on the Explorer blog where we post photos from our guests along with our show notes. And please join us on Facebook at the B&H Photography Podcast group where you can share your favorite photos and comments about the show. I'm your host, Derek Fosbender. Jill Waterman is our creative producer. Episodes are recorded, mixed, and edited by technical producer Mike Weinstein, and our executive producer is Richard Stevens. On behalf of us all, thank you so much for tuning in today.